One of the things that strikes me, and I guess reflecting back to my journey, because I think that there's many different reasons to do feedback informed treatment, many different motivations to go to this International Center for Clinical Excellence training in 2025 and learn fit. I would say when I first started my kind of journey, I was pretty hell bent on getting more effective. And as you've been able to tell us, we can get up to 25% more effective. But when I look back, having it done for maybe 5 or 6 years now, I also noticed that what I wanted was to help with some imposter syndrome and to help to feel reassured or more confident that what I'm doing in therapy, which can be very abstract, is helpful. And now, while we have got more effectiveness, myself and my team over the years with Fit, I would say the bigger value for me is about feeling less imposter syndrome. And I wonder if you can talk to that for some people that might be watching this that are unsure of themselves if they are helping and how, doing Fit might help them on that journey.
So interesting to hear this from you and from others,
Mm.
that there is a strong sense of feeling like I'm an imposter in the room with clients. And I'd like to do a bit of a reframe on that word.
Mm.
We know from research done by another Norwegian researcher, Helene Nielsen Lee, that therapists who embody a kind of professional self-doubt actually have better outcomes. So instead of imposter syndrome, how about we reframe that as humility? And secondly, instead of trying to erase it, let's embrace it. What we know is that when therapists attend continuing education, professional development kinds of workshops, that it actually increases their level of confidence without changing their ability to help. Now, that's truly being an imposter. So what we don't need is an overabundance of confidence based on using a particular model or technique.
Mm.
Instead, I'd say be humble, doubt yourself, and talk to your client about that. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't feel hopeful. The reason is that because clients are often quite robust, and the data say that being with us leads to a large effect, about a zero point 0.8 effect size. Let me just characterize that a bit. It's the same effect size as coronary artery bypass surgery. It's 4 times the effect size of fluoride in the prevention of dental caries. So in general, there isn't any reason to feel like an imposter. What we do works. However, we know the work can be messy from client to client and day to day. The best way to address that is to stay connected to your client, to ask them for feedback. What do you think? Are we making a difference? Are we connected with regard to what you're hoping for, using strategies and making suggestions that seem to fit for you, your values and worldview? Am I doing the job that you're hiring me to do with you? And if not, then I try to adjust, not being committed to my model, but believing that this client can change if we just find what's right for them. And it may not be with me.
Mm.
Maybe it's in another program. Maybe it's with another practitioner. But I believe that change is possible for you.
Scott, just hearing in this conversation as we talk about the client's voice in feedback, one thing that has struck me that I don't know if there is any research on, and I've never asked you this before, but is there any information out there on how feedback informed treatment may help from a cultural awareness or cultural competency point of view, where we're sitting in the room with someone who might be different to us in some way?
Well, I think there are a couple of things we can look at. First, our particular tools have been translated into about 35 different languages and used in just as many different cultures. And so far, when we compare the effects overall, and by the way, this is true with fit as well as psychological care, we don't see any difference in response in the aggregate.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean we're not going to see differences between me and this client and differences that I don't notice in the work that I'm doing with them. So by asking for feedback, using the measures, I can aggregate data and actually test whether or not I have a differential effect with certain kinds of clients, maybe based on their cultural background, their presentation type, their sexual orientation, and a host of other variables.
Mm.
And specifically, it gives me a way to foster a conversation between this particular client and me, because most of the studies that we do are comparing group responses. We put people in group A and people in group B, which isn't very good really for addressing the question about my helpfulness with this particular client from this background that might be different than my own.
Mm.
It's fine in a general question like, are there cultural differences between this group and that? The issue and the challenge is that in most instances, within group variability, that is, the differences between people in the same group, is greater than the differences between two different groups. Fit is a way to tease that out and make sure I'm attending to this person with that background at this time and that problem.
One of the one of the areas of therapy that is garnering a lot of interest, Scott, and certainly in Australia, it has now become a competency for psychologists, is deliberate practice. And let's talk about that. But I first want to start with your journey as someone who was finding this type of practice, deliberate practice, and really one of the forerunners bringing it into the psychotherapy world.
Hmm.
Tell me a bit about how you identify deliberate practice as a potential to help us in psychotherapy. And I guess as well, what does it mean for those people in Australia now looking at, gosh, I need to be competent in this?
Oh, this is such a big question, and there's really so much to say. The first article that was published about deliberate practice was one that we wrote in 2007, I think, called Super Shrinks: What's the Secret of Their Success? And the field is always known. And I think, if truth be told, individual providers could identify people within their orbit that they consider top performers, that work magic with clients that they might not be able to help, that they think of when thinking about referring somebody who has not responded to treatment. So, but the explanation of why they were achieving these effects had never really been very fulfilling. So a lot of it was peer nominations. Who do we think are the best therapists? Turns out those aren't very reliable. Or they would say these are just super empathizers. It doesn't seem to be the case. That seems something much more complex. So of course, I started by being trained in a very specific model. I moved to the area so I could work with the people who were developing that. We had researchers come in and hang with me here. It's a bit of a story. And they looked at our work and they came back to us. We were promising that the treatment would be briefer, shorter, more impactful. And the researchers found that it was the same as everything else.
Mm.
It helped people, but it wasn't any better. Very unsatisfying to most of the team. The team split up. We began looking at what we were calling the common factors,
Mm.
now called the therapeutic factors. The assumption here was that the expression of therapeutic genes can happen in a variety of ways, maybe cognitive, maybe emotion focused therapy, maybe behavioral therapy, but the DNA was largely the same. And maybe what we should do is identify that DNA.
Mm.
Problem with that is it's not very attractive to practitioners who are trying to talk to people in a culturally and time period relevant way. There's a reason why, for example, cognitive therapy was popular in the 1990s. We had the most literate generation in the history of the planet. How do they solve their problems? Well, they think them through. In the 50s, during the industrial era, people thought of humans much like they did the assembly line. So all you had to do was put them on that assembly line, change a few of the reinforcement contingents, and everything would be fine. And so on it goes. We gave that idea up simply because we found it difficult, even though we thought it was empirically valid, to attract clinicians who lived in the trenches and needed something quite specific to say. And then we began talking about measurement. I was very fortunate to have two really great teachers, Mike Lambert and Lynn Johnson, both who were saying, it's really time to simply ask the client. And I thought, yeah, this is great. Clinicians are free to do what makes sense in their particular context with the people they're working with. And then we just find out, did it help their client? Were they engaged by it? All right, long story. What we found within about 2 years was that certain therapists rose to the top in terms of outcomes, both in terms of retaining clients and the impact that they had. So we were back to the very same issue that clinicians had struggled with very early on. David Ricks wrote an article published in a very obscure book about that he called super shrinks,
Yeah.
actually. And he studied two clinicians and found that one was much more helpful than the other, even though they were seeing the exact same types of clients. 2010, Mike Lambert and a colleague, a student, Ikiji, published a numerical analysis of top performers. And they end their article by saying, it's clear they're there. It's clear it's not random, but how they do it is a mystery to us. All right. We are now there too. It's right around the same time period. And I'm on an airplane puzzling over these top performers, trying to figure out what is it that leads to their success. And I happen upon an article in a magazine I had never read. And there's a reason for that. The magazine was called Fortune Magazine. It's all about money. And if you're a therapist, you might as well just set that whole thing aside. You'll make a decent living, but you're not going to be on the cover of Fortune Magazine. Bored out of my mind, I opened it up and there was an article that had been written by the editor of the magazine, Jeff Colvin, about a guy named Anders Ericsson. Anders Ericsson, a Swedish psychologist who'd been studying top performers for 30 years. I'd never heard of the person. And he had looked at chess players and surgeons and history teachers and computer programmers, asking them and looking in detail at how come most of us who graduate, get a degree, start to work, stay average throughout our entire career, despite the same amount of effort than these people. What is it they're doing different? And the term he came up with, not our term, was deliberate practice. And so let me define deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is reaching for a performance objective that is beyond your current ability. What you're hearing a lot about in conversations in our field about deliberate practice is actually not what Erickson would identify as deliberate practice, purposeful reaching beyond your current level of performance. It's purposeful practice. It's a critical distinction. Everybody knows about purposeful practice. It's how you learn to drive your car. There was a certain pre-established criterion level of performance you had to meet, and you knew you'd met it when you went and the examiner said, here's your license, after you showed them your basic skills. Now, that license didn't mean that they should sign you up for the Indianapolis 500 and you were driving a Formula One race car. No, that's a whole nother level. You could do it, but that would require slowly reaching for objectives just beyond your current ability. So in order to deliberately practice, you have to know what your current ability is, which means you have to measure and then identify where the potential growth spots are. And it's amazing. And inspiring that the APS has made this a criterion illustrating our competence, because we have an evidence-based definition of competence as opposed to a performance-based definition of competence. If we say you have to master these 5 domains of knowledge, that is purposeful practice, which has its place. We would like more people on the roads to actually reach a basic level of driving ability. Just listen to yourself talk about it when you're in the car. But if you want to achieve a higher standard, you're going to have to measure your results, identify your deficits, and then get the coaching specific to that deficit from somebody who knows more about that than you in order to improve. Wow, that was a long answer. Sorry about that.
I loved it. Thanks so much, Scott. So, Scott, hearing you talk about deliberate practice, and particularly that deliberate practice, the new competency in Australia for psychologists, means that we are progressing and pushing forward where our client results are, which means that we need to know what our baseline results are, which coming back means, if I'm hearing correctly, we have to measure something to be able to do deliberate practice, whether it's feedback informed treatment or general outcome measures. Is that where we're getting to here, that actually to do this competency of deliberate practice, that we do need to measure something?
I don't see, and of course, my view is subject to change as it has multiple times throughout my career, how you can deliberately practice without knowing what your baseline performance level is.
Mm.
What I think is essential about this new competency is that it connects performance to outcome. Here's a frightening stat, and we now have multiple studies in the literature, the first of which I published along with a number of really talented researchers, which showed that therapist outcomes, individual therapist outcomes, my effectiveness does not improve over the course of my career.
Mm.
And it not only does not improve, it actually slowly deteriorates. And if you just let this sink in, you'll recognize this in other areas of your life.
Mm.
Driving is one of them. And were Anders still alive, he would say, just because you've been driving for 30 years doesn't mean you're getting better at it day by day.
Mm.
In fact, our skills collapse because the terrain that we are traversing mostly stays the same. That leads to a dulling of our senses. We see more of the same rather than the moments where we might try to improve our ability. And the environments tend to be forgiving.
Mm.
You run a red light, you don't get in a car accident every single time. You cross lanes without looking over your shoulder, you don't kill somebody on the roadway every single time. And we are inclined as a result to drift away from a pristine or high level competent performance. So I do think we need to measure our performance first to know what are we doing and are we staying the same in terms of our outcomes. But if we ever hope to improve, which is what deliberate practice is about, our efforts are going to have to be much more targeted. What you need to learn is going to be different from what I need to learn to help my clients. But our current professional development model is everybody needs to learn this,
Yeah.
which is not bad for purposeful or pre-established criterion levels of performance. But it is deadly if we think that's going to push our effectiveness levels higher.